Kenneth Douglas, you'll remember, has already admitted to having with the bodies of at least 3 women.
What happens when the very people entrusted with upholding justice and dignity betray that trust in the most disturbing ways?
Former Hamilton County Coroner's employee abused more than one corpse on the job.
When state employees, tasked with uncovering the truth, tamper with bodies, mix remains, or worse, exploit the dead for their own twisted purposes, the consequences are chilling. These shocking stories of corrupt coroners, caught in the act, will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about forensic integrity. Kenneth Douglas, predator in the morgue.
Former Hamilton County morgue employee is accused of having sex with a corpse.
In a quiet corner of Hamilton County, Ohio, a secret darkness was slowly creeping into the everyday life of the community. The local morgue, once seen as a place of respect and solace, became the stage for a horrifying tale that would haunt the county for decades. At the center of this nightmare was Kenneth Douglas, a man whose ordinary appearance belied a soul twisted by unspeakable desires. Every night, as the clock ticked past midnight and the silence of death settled over the morgue, a sinister presence awoke, setting the stage for a chilling story that would grip the community in terror. Douglas began his work at the morgue in the late 1970s, a time when people trusted that those who handled the dead would do so with dignity. He was a quiet, unassuming man who blended into the background, performing his duties with a calm professionalism that earned him the trust of his co-workers and the community. But beneath that calm exterior, a disturbing secret festered. Late at night, when the corridors of the morgue were empty and the only sounds were the hum of machines and the distant ticking of the clock, Douglas's true nature emerged. In the dark solitude, he engaged in acts so depraved that they defied belief. One chilling confession would later reveal the depths of his corruption. Douglas admitted that he had engaged in sexual acts with the lifeless bodies that came into his care. His words were blunt and cold, delivered without remorse, as if the act were nothing more than an odd quirk of his nature. "I would just get on top of them and pull my pants down," he had said. This simple yet horrifying statement sent shockwaves through the courtroom when it was finally revealed, and it did not take long for the whispers to grow into a deafening roar of disbelief and anger.
And this has been on my mind since this happened, on my conscience.
For years, the community remained unaware that the trusted coroner had been carrying out these gruesome acts behind closed doors. Families who had come to bid farewell to their loved ones never imagined that their trust had been so deeply betrayed. The morgue, a place where the dead were meant to be treated with honor, had become tainted by the presence of a man who twisted the final moments of life into something grotesque. The clockwork routine of the morgue, with its sterile environment and quiet dignity, hid a terror that would soon be uncovered. As the years passed, the hidden horror seemed destined to remain a dark secret, but the silence of the night could only hide the truth for so long. In 2012, the veil was finally lifted when the families of the victims, driven by grief and an unyielding demand for justice, took their case to court.
A federal appeals court hears arguments in a lawsuit brought by families of 3 people whose corpses were sexually abused at the Hamilton County morgue.
The evidence against Douglas was overwhelming. Forensic reports revealed that his DNA had been found on the body of Karen Range, a 19-year-old whose life was tragically cut short in 1992. This discovery was the spark that set off a chain reaction, exposing the hidden atrocities that had been committed over many years. The courtroom became a battleground where the community's deepest fears and sorrows were laid bare. Families were forced to listen as the horrifying details of Douglas's actions were recounted, each word deepening the sense of betrayal. The trial was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a painful reminder of how trust could be shattered by one man's dark obsession. Every witness, every piece of evidence, added another layer to the mounting suspense, leaving the courtroom and the community trembling with uncertainty about how such a horror had been allowed to persist. Amid the chaos of the trial, a particularly chilling moment emerged when Douglas's wife took the stand. Her testimony was like a twist in a dark tale. She recalled a time when she had called home to report that her husband was coming back from work reeking of alcohol. Instead of expressing concern, the response was a cold dismissal. Whatever happens on county property, on county time, is county business. This callous remark not only revealed the lack of oversight at the morgue, but also hinted at a far more disturbing institutional failure. It was a moment that deepened the sense of foreboding, suggesting that the evil lurking within the morgue was not entirely isolated. The legal battle that followed was long and grueling. Every day in the courtroom brought with it a reminder of the monstrous betrayal that had been inflicted upon the dead and the living alike. The community watched with bated breath as the evidence mounted, and with each revelation, the air grew heavier with the weight of sorrow and anger. The county officials tried to distance themselves from the horror, arguing that they could not be held accountable for the actions of one man. But as the trial unfolded, it became clear that the failure of oversight and the absence of proper supervision had allowed this nightmare to continue unchecked. In the end, the court ruled that the county could indeed be held responsible for its negligence. This decision was a small measure of justice in a case that had already left deep emotional scars on countless families. For those who had lost their loved ones, the pain was compounded by the knowledge that the very place meant to honor the dead had been defiled. The trial did not erase the memories of what had happened, but it did serve as a grim reminder that evil could lurk behind the most ordinary of facades. Dr. David Suetholz, the Coroner of Shadows.
Former Kenton County Coroner David Suetholz is appealing his convictions for illegally distributing prescription drugs, including opioids.
Dr. David Suetholz was once known as a kind and trustworthy man in Kenton County. For many years, he worked as the county's coroner, a job that meant facing death every day and giving answers to families who had lost their loved ones. People believed in his careful work and compassionate heart. Alongside his duties as a coroner, he also worked as a family doctor, treating patients with warmth and kindness. His gentle manner and willingness to help made him a familiar face in the community, and for a long time, his word was seen as a bond of trust. Behind the scenes, however, the story of Dr. Suetholz was not all as it seemed. Slowly and without much notice, a dark side grew hidden under the surface. In the quiet hours of the night, away from the caring smile he wore in public, he began to break the rules. He started to use his respected position for personal gain and made choices that would harm the very people who had once trusted him. What began as a small breach of ethics grew into a series of actions that would eventually ruin his career and shatter the faith of an entire community.
Former Kenton County Coroner was sentenced today to 1 year and a day in federal prison.
Dr. Suetholz's journey into darkness started with his work as a coroner. His job was to look at the causes of death, to piece together clues, and to help families understand why tragedy had struck. For many years, his work was marked by attention to detail and a steady calm that comforted those in grief. But behind closed doors, he was leading a double life. While the public saw a devoted servant of the law, a secret world of forbidden dealings was taking shape in his private practice. Over the decades, Dr. Suetholz built up a reputation as a trusted family doctor. People came to him with everyday illnesses, and he was there for routine checkups, minor ailments, and even serious health problems. Families came to him with the hope of healing and care. They believed that his dedication meant he always had their best interests at heart.
Suetholz was the elected county coroner for 30 years there and a family physician for 50 years.
Yet, as time passed, his actions began to stray from the promise he had made to help and protect his patients. It turned out that behind the caring facade, Dr. Suetholz was illegally handing out prescription drugs, including very addictive opioids. These drugs, meant to help people in pain, became tools for a darker trade. The good doctor who had once healed was now taking advantage of his role to supply drugs that many people would come to depend on. His actions hurt many lives. The drugs were meant to be controlled and given only when absolutely necessary, but he broke that promise over and over, ignoring the rules that were made to keep people safe. The truth came out when the Kentucky Board of Medical Licensure began to look into his past actions. They found that his behavior was not a one-time mistake, but part of a long pattern of breaking the law.
A federal prosecutor said that as a private physician, Suetholz's dangerous prescribing of high doses of opioids combined with other prescription drugs.
One case in particular showed that he had once prescribed methadone, a powerful drug, to a patient struggling with an addiction to OxyContin, all without the proper permits. This was a clear sign that Dr. Suetholz had been bending the rules for many years. As more evidence was gathered, it became clear that his betrayal of trust was deep and dangerous. When the full extent of his misdeeds was revealed, shock and disbelief swept through Kenton County. People who had once trusted him for comfort in times of sorrow now felt betrayed by a man who had taken advantage of his power. The community was left asking how someone they had known for so long could fall so far. It was a bitter lesson in how even those who seem devoted to the public good can sometimes stray into dangerous territory. The legal fallout was swift. Dr. Suetholz was arrested and put on trial for his crimes. The courtroom became a stage where the dark truths of his actions were laid bare. The evidence showed that he had knowingly and repeatedly distributed opioids without following the law. In the end, a federal jury found him guilty on 12 counts of illegally distributing these dangerous drugs.
Prosecutors say some patients were prescribed high doses of medications and dangerous combinations without any justification at all.
The trial revealed a man who had once worn a white coat of care, but had slowly been overtaken by greed and selfishness. Even as the trial ended, Dr. Suetholz's story was not over. His attorneys argued that the judge had made several serious mistakes during the trial. They claimed that the judge allowed the jury to hear evidence that should never have been shared, and that this evidence unfairly turned the jury against him. Details about the deaths of 2 patients who had died from drug overdoses, even though Dr. Suetholz had not prescribed the drugs that caused their deaths, were allowed into the courtroom. His lawyers said these details unfairly painted him as a monster, a tactic that biased the jury from the start. Despite these arguments, the conviction stood. As the legal process continued, Dr. Suetholz was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in prison, a sentence that left many in the community wondering if the punishment fit the gravity of his actions. For some, the sentence seemed too light for a man who had once been seen as a pillar of support and care. Yet, the case served as a strong reminder: no one, not even those in positions of great trust and authority, is above the law. David Fuller, monster in the morgue. In a quiet corner of Britain, a man managed to hide a dark secret for more than 30 years. David Fuller, who at first seemed like an ordinary hospital maintenance worker, turned out to be one of the country's most twisted and dangerous criminals.
David Fuller murdered 2 women and sexually abused at least 100 bodies in hospital mortuaries.
His story is one of hidden evil, abuse, and a failure of the very systems meant to protect people. For decades, Fuller went about his work, seemingly harmless. While behind closed doors, he carried out unspeakable acts. He used his job to gain access to the most private spaces of the hospital, the mortuaries, and committed crimes that shocked everyone when they finally came to light. It all began with the murders of 2 young women. The first was Wendy Nell, a 25-year-old woman who managed a small photography store in a busy town. One fateful day in June 1987, Wendy's boyfriend made a grisly discovery in her modest home. Her naked body lay in a bed stained with blood. It soon became clear that she had been brutally attacked and strangled.
David Fuller struck, strangled, and sexually abused 25-year-old Wendy.
Only a few months later, another tragedy struck. Caroline Pierce, a 20-year-old waitress known for her friendly smile and kind nature, was taken from outside her home. Unlike Wendy, Caroline was found in a remote area, her body hidden away from the public eye. Her death was marked by cruelty, leaving behind a trail of questions that baffled the police for years. Back then, police detectives worked hard to solve these crimes. However, without the modern tools of DNA testing and with poor forensic samples, their investigations soon ran cold. The case, dubbed the bedsit murders because both victims were found in humble living spaces, remained unsolved for over 3 decades. Meanwhile, Fuller continued his life, moving quietly through the hospital corridors and maintenance areas, far from the public eye and suspicion. Over the years, Fuller's true nature revealed itself in the most disturbing way. As a maintenance worker, he had a special swipe card that let him move freely in the hospital. This access allowed him to enter areas like mortuaries where bodies were kept. In these silent rooms, Fuller carried out acts that no one could have imagined. He sexually abused the bodies of at least 101 women and girls, whose ages ranged from as young as 9 to as old as 100. These were women who had died by accident, on the wards, or even during surgery. The post-mortem rooms, unlike other parts of the hospital, had no CCTV cameras. This lack of oversight, meant to preserve the dignity of the dead, instead gave Fuller a place to act without being caught. For 15 long years, he was able to roam these halls of death unchecked. It was a period marked by serious failings in hospital security, where simple measures could have stopped him. The doors to the fridges holding the corpses were left unlocked in the post-mortem rooms. It was here that Fuller committed his vile acts, his crimes hidden behind closed doors and locked storage areas.
Trying to understand how Fuller committed his crimes might now finally be revealed, but why he did it.
No one suspected the quiet, unassuming man who seemed so ordinary in everyday life. The investigation into Fuller's crimes eventually took a dramatic turn with the help of modern DNA techniques. When an enhanced DNA sample was taken from the body of Caroline Pierce, it opened the door to a reinvestigation of the old cases. But it was a sample from Wendy Nell that led detectives to a major breakthrough. With the help of a national database, police discovered that the DNA matched a man who had once been a suspect in other cases. Slowly, detectives worked their way from a relative of Fuller to Fuller himself. When police finally went to his house, Fuller denied any connection to the murders. However, the evidence was overwhelming. His DNA, along with a fingerprint found on a piece of evidence in Wendy's home, matched perfectly with the crimes. The shocking discovery did not end with the murders. During a search of his house and home office, detectives found hidden computer drives, CDs, and even old floppy disks filled with millions of images.
Evidence that linked Fuller to the Bedsit murders was not all police found when they searched his home.
These files contained graphic evidence of his abuse, thousands of pictures and hundreds of videos that showed his persistent and vile interest in rape, abuse, and murder. Every file on his computer painted a picture of a man who had committed unspeakable acts, his behavior as dark as it was calculated. Fuller's trial finally came in 2021. After initially denying the charges, he eventually pleaded guilty to the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce. He also admitted to 44 charges related to his sexual abuse of the bodies in the mortuaries. In all, the investigation revealed that 101 victims had been abused in the hospital's morgues. It was a number that shook the nation and left many wondering how such a monster could operate for so long. The courts had no choice but to give him a whole life prison term in December 2021, a sentence that meant he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, never to see the outside world again. The horror of David Fuller's crimes did not end with his life sentence. In December 2022, he was sentenced again for the further abuse of 23 bodies. Each sentence reinforced the seriousness of his actions and the deep pain he had caused to so many families and communities. The 69-year-old man earned a notorious nickname, with some media calling him the monster in the morgue. His case became a stark reminder of how evil can sometimes hide behind the mask of normalcy. Shannon Kent, A Tale of Dark Secrets.
Shannon Kent pleaded guilty back in December as criminal charges followed a series of troubling reports by Denver 7 Investigate.
In a quiet town where trust was once a given, the shocking story of Shannon Kent slowly unfolded. Kent, a man who held a position that demanded care and respect, became a figure of disgrace and suspicion. For years, he had worn two hats, one as the Lake County Coroner, a job he was elected to in 2014, and the other as the owner of a private funeral home and mortuary franchise. His dual roles gave him a powerful standing in the community, a standing that would later be tarnished by a series of troubling events. The tale began to twist in 2019, when whispers of wrongdoing first surfaced. It was during this time that Kent faced charges for using his wife as a deputy coroner, despite her not having the proper certification. Such a move, meant perhaps to bolster his office or keep family control over his business, raised alarms among those who believed that trust in a public servant should never be taken lightly. People began to wonder if there were more secrets hidden behind the polished exterior of his career. But the real turning point came in the fall of 2020. An ordinary day took a dark turn when a grieving woman approached the Lake County Sheriff's Office. She claimed that the ashes of her infant, who had passed away in December 2019, did not seem right. The cremated remains were heavier than expected and raised suspicions about what they might contain. The woman's gut feeling turned into an official complaint, and soon, the investigation that would expose the hidden horrors of Kent's operations was underway. Investigators followed the clues and soon turned their attention to the basement of Kent's home.
Shannon Kent pleaded guilty back in December as criminal charges followed a series of troubling reports by Denver 7 Investigate.
A place that was not only his private residence, but also housed part of his funeral home business. On October 20th, law enforcement officers, including Lake County Sheriff Amy Reyes, descended on the property without warning. What they found inside was a sight that none of them would soon forget. The basement was cluttered with stacks of paperwork that had spilled from overflowing boxes and cabinets. Used body bags and gloves lay scattered across the floor, as if in silent testimony to the grim work that had been done there. There were open bottles of chemicals and shelves lined with medications and cremation containers, hinting at a messy mix of business and neglect. As the officers ventured further, the stench of decay and chemicals filled the air. Pools of body fluids had formed near an examination table, and the sight was so disturbing that Sheriff Reyes admitted she began to feel sick, weak, and lightheaded. Her decision to end the search early was made at that moment, a decision that only deepened the mystery surrounding the activities taking place in that hidden space. The search eventually revealed even more alarming details. The records of the 2019 case involving the grieving mother seemed to vanish without explanation, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. The evidence suggested that the ashes delivered to the grieving family were not simply those of her infant. Tests showed that the remains contained bits of metal, which might have come from jewelry.
Minimum of 2 individuals and materials consistent with jewelry, fasteners, and surgical material.
And even suggested that the mix might include remains of another adult and possibly an animal. For a community that once trusted its coroner to treat the dead with dignity and care, the idea that a trusted public servant could mix up such vital and sensitive matters was both heartbreaking and enraging. In the aftermath of this unsettling discovery, the wheels of justice began to turn. Just 3 days after the basement search, the state took the bold step of suspending Kent's license to run 2 of his 5 mortuaries. The pressure mounted rapidly, and within weeks, he found himself surrendering the licenses for all his businesses. The once powerful and respected figure was now facing the consequences of actions that many felt were rooted in arrogance and greed. Finally, the court came down on him. Judge Catherine Scherutz, speaking in a tone that mixed disappointment with a sense of finality, remarked that Kent had allowed his power to turn into entitlement.
Probation was not appropriate based on Shannon Kent's history as the county coroner. The judge went on to say,
his position, once seen as one of great honor and responsibility, had instead become a shield for his misdeeds. The judge made it clear that probation would not suffice as a punishment for someone who had betrayed the trust of the public. As a result, Shannon Kent was sentenced to 6 months in the Lake County Jail, a sentence that, though it may seem light to some, marked the beginning of the end for a career that had spiraled into corruption. Jerry Bridges, the betrayer of trust. Jerry Bridges had once been a respected coroner in Jones County, Georgia, a man known for his calm manner and careful work in handling the final arrangements of those who had passed away. His life seemed to follow a steady and honorable path. Growing up in a small town, he learned early about the importance of trust, community, and service. Families looked up to him and trusted him with one of the most delicate tasks anyone could ever face, caring for the dead and giving their loved ones proper closure. Over decades, he built a reputation as a man who would treat the deceased and their grieving families with respect and sensitivity. Yet, hidden behind that caring exterior lay a secret that would later shatter the very trust he had spent his life earning. For many years, Bridges worked as a coroner, a role that demanded both science and compassion.
Former funeral home owner and Jones County coroner Jerry Bridges pleaded guilty and is now awaiting sentencing.
He was responsible for determining the causes of death, often working with police, doctors, and family members in a search for answers. People came to rely on his knowledge and his steady presence during moments of great sorrow. His office became a place where grief met order, and where painful truths were uncovered calmly and methodically. But behind the scenes, Bridges was doing something entirely unexpected. something that would betray the faith that the community had placed in him. Bridges began to ask families for money in advance to cover funeral and burial expenses. At first, this might have seemed like a reasonable request, given the often high costs associated with funerals. He reassured them that their money would be kept safe and used only to pay for the services that would honor their loved ones. In a time when families were vulnerable and desperate for some sign of hope in their pain, his words were like a small comfort in an overwhelming storm. The families believed that by paying ahead, they could avoid further complications during their time of grief. However, as time passed, the reality of Bridges' actions started to come into focus.
The sheriff's office says Bridges took that money in his role as a former owner of a funeral home and of a cemetery.
Instead of setting aside the money as promised, he began to use it for his own benefit. Every dollar that was meant to secure a proper farewell for the deceased ended up lining his own pockets. The trust that the families had given him was broken with every transaction. When the deception was finally uncovered, it was not just the financial loss that hit the families hard, but the deep betrayal they felt. Their grief was compounded by the realization that the one person they had relied upon to care for their loved one had instead chosen to exploit their sorrow. In June 2019, the truth was finally exposed. Authorities began to piece together the evidence that showed how Bridges had been diverting funds meant for funeral expenses. His arrest sent shockwaves throughout the small community, a place where everyone had once spoken highly of his professionalism and kindness.
Until he saw reports that Bridges was arrested in June of 2019.
Suddenly, those same voices were filled with disbelief and sorrow. Families that had once trusted him now found themselves questioning how a man who appeared so caring could commit such a cold and calculated act of fraud. The news of his arrest was like a sudden storm in a clear sky, darkening the hopes and memories of many. As more victims came forward, it became clear that Bridges' scheme was neither a one-time mistake nor a minor lapse in judgment. Over time, he had taken money from dozens of families, accumulating more than $200,000 in funds that were supposed to be reserved for final rites.
Gleaton says Bridges stole over $100,000 from families, some funds going back to the 1990s.
For the families, this was not merely a matter of money, it was a deep wound that reopened old griefs. Many of them were already struggling with the pain of loss, and the discovery of the fraud added another layer of hardship to their lives. Some families found themselves unable to afford even the basic expenses they needed to properly say goodbye to their loved ones. Others were forced to take on extra work or borrow money, further straining the fragile balance of their lives. The court case that followed was a bitter moment for the community. Bridges eventually pleaded guilty to 43 counts related to fraud. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with a mix of anger, sadness, and a sense of disbelief that such a respected figure had turned out to be so deeply dishonest. The judge listened to the many stories of loss and betrayal, stories that painted a picture of a man who had not only misused money, but also shattered the trust of the community. The legal process revealed the many layers of Bridges' actions, showing that his decisions were not made in a moment of weakness, but rather as part of a long-term pattern of deceit. Bridges' age and poor health were taken into consideration when the judge decided on his sentence. Although he could have faced a much longer prison term, the court ultimately sentenced him to 5 years in prison, along with 15 years of probation. The sentence was seen as a way to hold him accountable without completely disregarding the circumstances that led to his actions. Yet for the victims, no sentence could truly erase the pain or restore the trust that had been lost. They continued to live with the memories of being betrayed in one of their darkest moments, a stark reminder that even those who seem to offer comfort may have secrets that can cause lasting damage. With so many shocking cases of corruption and incompetence in the world of forensic pathology, it makes you wonder how many other cover-ups or chilling secrets are still buried beneath the surface.